In other news, Cuban forces have killed 4 people who were on board a Florida-registered speedboat. Havana says the vessel was intercepted in Cuban waters after passengers opened fire on a Coast Guard boat. It's not immediately clear what the vessel and its occupants were doing in Cuban waters. The highly unusual incident took place amid heightened tensions with the United States, which has blocked virtually all oil shipments to the island, increasing pressure on the communist-run government. Well, for more, let's cross live now to France 24's Ed Augustin. He's standing by for us. Ed, we heard a short time ago from the US Vice President saying that we don't have much yet in the way of details here. What more do we know at this stage about what actually happened and why?
Well, about 3 hours ago, the Cuban Ministry of the Interior published a communique, and really that's all the international media have to go on at the moment. A Florida-registered speedboat, according to the Cuban authorities, approximately a kilometer away from central Cuba's northern coast. The Cuban authorities say that that boat was there early on Wednesday morning, and that a firefight broke out. The Cuban authorities say that it was the other speedboat, the speedboat that's Florida registered, that came, and we don't really have any more details. I think it's worth pointing out the historical context. So historically, a lot of, how to put it, Cuba over the last 5 years has undergone a historic amount of immigration. Now, most of that immigration has been people leaving to the United States, and frankly, the rich fly or have flown before Trump came back for a second time. But a lot of people are people trafficked between Cuba and Florida. There's a huge Cuban-American diaspora in Florida. And it costs about $10,000, $15,000, or did a couple of years ago, to get people out off the island. And so that was at least a blossoming trade. It's very difficult to report on. Of course, it's by definition illegal. And what we've seen from what I've heard firsthand from testimonies from family members here, and I've seen plenty of videos on social media, is that even jet skis sometimes come and pick people up off the northern coast. This has been going on for decades in Cuba. And what tends to happen, according to the Cuban authorities, this hasn't been confirmed, is that the trading pattern is as follows. Synthetic drugs are delivered from Florida and then sold in the Cuban market. There's a rising drug problem that's killing many Cubans. Quite interesting that, or tragic, because historically the recreational drug use was very, very low. And that's risen significantly. And on the way back from Cuba to Florida, people are trafficked. It's also worth pointing out that Cuban authorities have for years been saying that there have been provocations, as they call it, people coming with arms to the Cuban coast to try and provoke. And I was involved in a documentary a number of years ago with a Miami restaurateur who talked about how back in the 1990s, he was recruited to come down to northern Cuba and just shoot from the relative safety of a safe boat, of a boat at hotels and installations and go back. So this has been a historical pattern from the extreme right in the Cuban American community in Florida. Historically, there's been impunity. There have been very few convictions of this. So that's the historical pattern. It's happening in the context when the United States thinks and is telegraphing that it's following a policy of regime change, and it thinks it can overthrow, or it says it thinks it can overthrow the Cuban government before the year's out. But I emphasize, we don't know very many details yet. The US government is yet to comment specifically beyond Vice President Vance's comments that you alluded to.
And Ed, it's not unusual, I suppose, for skirmishes to happen between the Cuban Coast Guard and US-flagged vessels. As you say, there's a lot of activity in those waters. But how rare is it for passengers to actually be hurt or to be killed in one of these incidents?
It's very rare. There was a report that Cuban authorities claimed back in 2024, 2 years ago, that they intercepted somebody on a jet ski who was trafficking drugs. So we get reports and unverifiable claims from the Cuban authorities. This goes out on the national television a lot about a constant illegal flow of drugs, of people trafficking arms, so-called counter-revolutionaries, the authorities say would put it. But it's very difficult to verify. In terms of deaths, those of us that are old hands in Cuba are thinking back to the Brothers to the Rescue incident that happened 30 years ago, in which there was the rafters crisis in the 1990s. The Soviet Union had a few years before collapsed. Cuba, similar to now, was going through a massive economic crisis, and lots of Cubans were leaving on rafts to get to Florida. And in that context, there were repeated invasions of Cuban airspace by US-backed Miami exiles. And there was a famous shooting down in international airspace, not Cuban airspace, but after Cuba had repeatedly warned about its airspace being provoked, and people died during that. And in response, the Clinton administration, of course, a Democratic administration that at the time was tepidly seeking an improvement in relations with Cuba, responded with very, very powerful sanctions. And so we'll see, I think, in the coming days, if this is the casus belli that many in the State Department are plainly looking for.
Well, Ed, thanks so much for joining us with that detail. That's France 24 correspondent in Havana, Ed Augustin.